Hello, everyone. I'm glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from? And what time is it right now where you are? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, listening to the same story. Some of you perhaps drifting off to sleep, others just beginning their evening, maybe even sitting in the quiet of early morning. As you listen, imagine yourself stepping into another time, another place, a Europe torn apart by war, where ordinary people had to become extraordinary just to survive. Tonight, we are going to wander through the forests, villages, and ruined cities of World War II to see what it was like to live as a partisan. One of those hidden fighters who moved in the shadows, who lived between fear and courage, and whose lives were filled with danger, but also small victories, laughter, hunger, and resilience. Being a partisan in Europe during the Second World War was not like being a soldier in a regular army. It wasn't rows of uniforms, clear orders, or well-supplied camps. It was a life in the forests, the mountains, and the hidden corners of occupied towns. It was nights that never seemed completely dark, because even in silence there was the weight of fear. At any moment, the sound of boots on gravel could mean discovery. And yet, for many men and women, young and old, this was the only path they felt was right to resist. Some had lost family to the occupiers, some were driven by patriotism, and others simply could not live under the constant humiliation of occupation. The forests and hills of Europe became their refuge, their base, their fragile sanctuary. Imagine walking into one of those forests. It's cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and you're carrying little more than an old rifle, maybe not even that, perhaps just a pistol or a knife. Food is scarce, your boots are worn, and you don't know when you'll next eat a proper meal. The partisans had no supply lines like regular armies. Instead, they relied on local villagers who would secretly bake bread, hide salted meat, or smuggle potatoes in baskets. Sometimes it was enough, other times it was barely a crust. Hunger was a constant companion. They would boil wild roots, eat berries, even steal supplies from enemy depots when they dared. In some regions, children acted as couriers, slipping unnoticed through checkpoints with small packages of food tucked inside baskets of laundry. Despite the hardships, there was a strange sense of freedom in partisan life. They were no longer living under the direct rules of the occupiers, no longer forced to march in step with propaganda or salute a flag they despised. Instead, they made their own rules, their own fragile communities deep in the woods. Around the fire, they shared stories, sang songs in hushed voices, or listened to the crackling of the radio, straining to catch news from London, Moscow, or the underground broadcasts. Every scrap of information was treasured. An announcement of Allied victories, rumors of new weapons, or coded messages instructing sabotage operations. It was like breathing a little more easily, knowing that somewhere, far away, the tide of war might be turning. Not all of them were hardened fighters. Many partisans were teenagers, students, or farmers who had never held a weapon before. Some were women who carried not only rifles but also the weight of organizing food, caring for the wounded, or serving as messengers between scattered groups. There were even elderly villagers who helped by guiding younger fighters through the forest paths they had known since childhood. What united them was not training, but determination. They built camps out of fallen logs, dug shelters into the earth, and learned how to live almost invisibly. But invisibility was never perfect. The enemy hunted them constantly, sending patrols with dogs, setting traps, and offering rewards for information. Betrayal was a shadow always present. Neighbors could not always be trusted, and in some cases, even friends or relatives gave away hiding places to save themselves or to earn food rations. To counter this, partisans developed elaborate codes. They left small marks on trees to guide each other, used songs as signals, or knocked on doors in strange rhythms to announce themselves. A single mistake could cost not just one life, but an entire camp. And yet, in the midst of this uncertainty, there were moments of warmth. Imagine a snowy evening, deep in the forest, where a partisan group sat huddled around a small fire hidden inside a dugout shelter. Someone would pull out a harmonica, its notes fragile but hopeful, and others would join in with voices. For a few minutes, laughter would echo softly, and they would talk not of war, but of home, of what they would do when peace returned. Perhaps one dreamed of opening a bakery again, another of seeing a child grow up in freedom. These dreams gave them strength, even when reality pressed down like the weight of endless winter. Food remained a central part of their struggles, and the way they ate shaped much of their days. Bread was more than just sustenance, it was life itself. When flour ran out, they mixed in ground acorns, tree bark, or anything that could stretch a meal further. Soups were brewed from wild herbs, nettles, and anything green that could be boiled. Sometimes luck brought a deer or wild boar, and then for a brief time they feasted. But those moments were rare, and often they saved dried meat for the wounded or the youngest among them. Hunger wasn't only physical. It was a reminder of how fragile their existence was, how much depended on chance, courage, and the kindness of strangers. Partisans also lived with stories, rumors, and whispered legends. In the forests of Poland, for instance, people told of ghostly figures who guided the lost at night, perhaps fallen comrades whose spirits remained. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, fighters believed that certain caves were cursed and refused to sleep in them no matter how desperate. These superstitions, while irrational, gave shape to their fears and created a sense of continuity with older traditions. War had torn apart everything familiar, but old beliefs connected them to their ancestors. What made their story even more remarkable was the way they created joy in such grim times. Someone might carve a chest set from wood, and matches would last for hours. Others told jokes, sometimes about the enemy, sometimes about themselves. Humor was a form of resistance, a way to remind themselves that they were still human, still alive. Even under the threat of sudden raids, they laughed. And in that laughter, there was defiance. As night deepened in those forests, with only the glow of hidden fires and the distant howl of wolves, the partisans waited. They waited for news, for opportunities, for the chance to strike and vanish again into the darkness. Each day was uncertain, but each day also carried the possibility of survival, of resistance, and of a future that would outlast the war. Life as a partisan did not follow the rhythm of ordinary days. There was no calendar, no strict schedule of work and rest, but rather a constant flow of waiting, hiding, moving, and reacting to whatever the war brought. Dawn often came with cold dew clinging to clothes and the heavy silence of the forest pressing against the ears. Some mornings began with cautious walks through the undergrowth to collect berries or mushrooms, tasks that seemed simple but were filled with danger. If a fighter strayed too far, they risked stumbling into enemy patrols or ambushes. Even gathering firewood required scouts to watch the paths, ready to whistle a warning at the first sign of movement. The partisans lived with the sounds of nature, but they listened to them differently than any farmer or hunter. The rustle of leaves might be just the wind, or it might be the careful tread of boots. A distant dog's bark could be from a shepherd, or it could be from a soldier's hound trained to track. Each noise had to be weighed, each sound measured against instinct. They learned to distinguish between the crack of a dry branch under a deer's hoof and the sharper snap of a rifleman stepping too carelessly. This constant alertness created a kind of tension that never fully disappeared, even in moments of rest. Shelter was always temporary. Caves, abandoned barns, dugouts beneath the earth. None were safe for long. Whenever a place became too familiar, whenever paths to it became too well worn, the risk of discovery grew. Camps were dismantled and rebuilt in new places, leaving behind only ashes and the faint outline of footprints. Still, the partisans developed a certain skill in hiding. Dugouts were roofed with logs and branches, then covered in soil and leaves so they blended perfectly with the forest floor. Smoke from fires was minimized by burning damp wood in carefully dug chimneys that carried fumes away from the camp in thin, nearly invisible trails. It was a delicate balance between staying warm enough not to freeze and staying hidden enough not to be found. Weapons were as uneven as the fighters themselves. Some had old rifles left over from the previous war, rusty but still usable. Others carried shotguns from village farms, while a few lucky ones had managed to steal submachine guns from enemy depots. Ammunition was precious, counted and recounted, each bullet saved for the right moment. Many partisans trained themselves to strip weapons apart, to clean them carefully, to know exactly how many shots they could afford to fire. In some regions, homemade explosives were crafted from fertilizer, wires, and scavenged metal. These improvised devices were dangerous not only for the enemy but also for the ones making them, yet they were necessary. Blowing up rail lines, sabotaging bridges, or cutting communication cables became one of the most effective ways to resist. But sabotage was not only about destruction. It was about psychology. When a German train derailed in the night, when a road was suddenly blocked by fallen trees, when telegraph lines mysteriously went silent, the occupiers felt the pressure. It reminded them that control was never complete, that the land they marched across was alive with resistance. For the partisans, these moments brought both satisfaction and renewed danger, because retaliation was swift and brutal. Entire villages could be burned, families executed, fields destroyed, simply because fighters had struck nearby. This cruel reality weighed heavily on the conscience of every partisan. Each action carried a question. Was the victory worth the suffering it might unleash on innocent people? And yet, doing nothing was not an option either, for silence meant surrender. The bond between fighters and villagers was complicated. On the one hand, peasants often provided bread, shelter, and information, quietly risking their lives to support the cause. On the other hand, fear was enormous. Occupying forces punished even the smallest sign of collaboration, sometimes posting bodies on village squares as warnings. Because of this, villagers sometimes turned away from partisans, or even betrayed them, not out of malice but out of desperation to protect their own families. Trust had to be earned slowly, through actions, respect, and careful promises. A partisan who shared food with a hungry child or helped mend a roof in secret built more loyalty than one who demanded supplies at gunpoint. Despite the dangers, there were also sparks of human closeness. In hidden camps, friendships deepened quickly. People who might never have spoken in times of peace found themselves bound together by the shared struggle. A student from the city might sit beside an old shepherd, both shivering under the same blanket, sharing the same stale bread. A woman who once sewed dresses for weddings now sewed patches into torn uniforms. A boy who had barely turned 16 might receive advice from a man who had fought in the First World War, the experience passing from one generation to another in whispered lessons. These bonds created families of resistance, fragile but strong, built not on blood but on necessity. And yet, partisans were still human, and humans seek moments of light even in the darkest times. Someone would sometimes produce a hidden bottle of homemade liquor, and suddenly, for an evening, laughter replaced fear. They sang songs from their childhood, argued over politics, or told jokes about the enemy's clumsiness. It was dangerous, of course, to let down one's guard, but it was necessary too, for without these small escapes, the pressure would crush them. One memoir from a Yugoslav fighter described how they even celebrated birthdays in the forest, with a slice of bread sprinkled with sugar as a cake, and a song whispered so softly that the trees themselves seemed to lean closer to hear. Rumors spread constantly among partisans. They heard stories of Allied landings, of secret weapons, of revolts in faraway cities. Some of these were true, others wildly exaggerated, but all of them fed hope. Hope was the most valuable currency, more powerful than bullets or bread. Hope allowed them to keep moving through snow, to face another night of uncertainty, to endure hunger and cold. Without hope, the forest would become a prison. With it, the forest became a fortress. At night, lying on rough blankets or even just on pine branches, they thought about home. Many could still picture the faces of their families, the smell of kitchens, the sound of bells in quiet villages. Some had left without saying goodbye, others had watched their homes burn. Those memories were painful, but they were also reminders of why they fought. The war was not just about survival in the woods. It was about reclaiming a life stolen by occupation. And so, each morning when they rose with stiff bodies and empty stomachs, they carried those memories like weapons, sharper than knives, heavier than rifles, but impossible to take away. The forest, though a shelter, was never fully a place of peace. It was alive not only with birdsong and the rustle of branches, but also with the invisible pressure of danger. Every path was a gamble, every clearing a possible trap. To move in daylight meant taking risks, so the partisans often shifted under the cover of darkness, their eyes trained to see in moonlight, their ears straining to catch the faintest sound of movement. They carried their weapons close, not because they believed they could always fight back, but because the act of carrying something sharp or loaded reminded them that they were not entirely powerless. Ambushes became part of their life. These were not grand battles with tanks and artillery, but sudden strikes, flashes of violence in otherwise silent nights. A small group of fighters might lie in wait near a dirt road, their bodies hidden beneath branches, their hearts pounding in rhythm with each distant rumble of a truck. When the moment came, they moved quickly, rolling a log across the path, cutting lantern wires, striking with grenades or rifles. The goal was not always to kill but to disrupt, to remind the occupiers that the land resisted them. And after each strike came the hardest part, the escape. Melting back into the woods, leaving no trace, carrying with them the echoes of gunfire and the knowledge that retaliation would follow. Retaliation was the constant shadow. For every bridge destroyed, for every convoy attacked, the enemy often turned its rage on the nearest village. Houses were torched, barns emptied, men and women dragged into squares. This knowledge weighed heavily on partisans. They had chosen to fight, but many of those who suffered had not. And yet, even under the threat of collective punishment, there were villagers who continued to help, slipping bread into sacks, hiding weapons beneath hay, pretending ignorance when questioned. Their courage was quiet, almost invisible, but without it the partisans could not have survived. Stories spread among fighters like sparks catching dry grass. Some were tales of miraculous escapes, like the man who leapt from a moving train bound for a labor camp and found his way back to the forest with nothing but torn clothes. Others were warnings, whispers of groups betrayed by informants, camps surrounded in the night, men and women taken away never to be seen again. These stories were not told to frighten but to remind each person of the thin line they walked daily. Hope and despair existed side by side, often in the same campfire conversations. The psychological strain was immense. Many partisans slept lightly, waking at the crack of a twig, their nerves stretched thin by months of vigilance. Some began to dream of raids even while awake, jumping at the sight of their own comrades returning through the trees. Still, there was no room for weakness. The group depended on each individual, and fear had to be hidden, tucked away beneath laughter or silence. This was perhaps one of the heaviest burdens of all, the inability to show how deeply the war gnawed at their minds. Yet, even in this relentless tension, there were strange pockets of beauty. A sunrise over the frost-covered fields, seen from a hidden hilltop, could silence a group for minutes, each person staring as if the colors themselves were proof that life continued beyond the war. In spring, when flowers pushed stubbornly through the soil, partisans picked them absent-mindedly, tucking them into rifle straps or placing them near the sleeping wounded. It was a reminder that the world itself resisted destruction, that nature continued to bloom even in fields scarred by conflict. Entertainment was rare, but it existed. Fighters carved dice from bones, played cards from worn decks passed between dozens of hands, or told endless stories. Some stories were about past adventures, others about imagined futures, fantasies of peace, of meals so large they could never finish them, of dances in villages lit by lanterns. These dreams often began as jokes but sometimes ended with silence, as each fighter fell into their own vision of what might come after survival. Clothing was another constant struggle. Uniforms stolen from the enemy were sometimes worn, not only for disguise but because they were warmer and more durable than civilian clothes. But wearing them carried risk. Villagers might mistake them for enemy soldiers, and actual soldiers might shoot them on sight. Shoes were patched and repatched, soles tied together with string or wire. Some fighters wrapped their feet in rags when boots finally gave out. In winter, frostbite was as dangerous as bullets, and fires could not always be lit for fear of smoke. To lose toes or fingers in the cold was to lose the ability to fight, and many bore scars from winters that seemed to stretch endlessly. Every partisan group had its own rhythm, its own way of surviving. In the mountains of Greece, fighters used goats to carry supplies along narrow paths. In the forests of Belarus, they built elaborate underground bunkers with hidden chimneys, living almost like moles. In France, resistance cells in towns disguised themselves as workers, shopkeepers, or students, striking suddenly before fading into the crowd. Though methods differed, the essence was the same: blend in, disrupt, survive. Radio became a lifeline. Whenever a group managed to acquire a working set, evenings transformed. The crackle of distant broadcasts filled dugouts. Voices from faraway cities carried through static. Sometimes it was coded messages, sometimes news of battles far beyond their reach. A mention of Allied troops advancing, of victories in Africa, or of bombings in Germany could send a wave of cautious hope through the group. Even when they did not fully trust the reports, the act of listening itself connected them to a larger world, making them feel less isolated. Trust among partisans was both vital and fragile. Betrayal always lurked, sometimes from those least expected. There were stories of infiltrators pretending to join only to lead enemy patrols to camps. Because of this, newcomers were watched carefully. Questions were asked, stories tested, backgrounds checked. Only after weeks, sometimes months, of proven loyalty did true trust form. And once it did, bonds were unbreakable. Fighters shared everything: food, clothes, even the last bullet if needed. Night operations often ended with long marches through darkness, guided by stars or the faint glow of villages in the distance. Silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of boots or the hiss of wind in the trees. Each step carried both exhaustion and determination. They walked not only for survival but also for the idea that someday their footsteps would no longer need to hide, that they could walk openly down the streets of their towns without fear. Until then, the forest remained their home, their shield, their silent witness. The life of a partisan was balanced constantly on the edge of danger, and there were times when the line between life and death grew so thin it almost disappeared. These moments often came without warning. A quiet evening in a forest camp could turn suddenly into chaos if the sound of engines echoed from a road too close, or if dogs began barking in the distance. Sometimes it was nothing, a passing patrol searching blindly, but other times it was the beginning of a manhunt, and every second counted. In those moments, the entire camp seemed to move as one body, grabbing weapons, stuffing scraps of bread into pockets, dousing fires with earth, and disappearing into the trees before the enemy arrived. One account told of a group hiding in a barn when soldiers came knocking on the doors of the village. The fighters pressed themselves against the hay, barely daring to breathe, as boots and rifles passed only a few steps away. Dust fell from the rafters, and the smell of straw mixed with sweat and fear. A child, no older than 10, kept watch at the edge of the yard, pretending to play with a stick. When the soldiers finally left, the child ran to the barn and whispered that it was safe. It was moments like this that reminded the partisans of how much depended on courage that often came from the unlikeliest people. Encounters on the roads were even riskier. Imagine walking at night, the forest pressing close on both sides, when suddenly headlights flared ahead. A vehicle approached, the rumble of its engine vibrating through the ground. Fighters would drop to the ditch, lying flat, their faces pressed into cold earth as the truck passed only a few meters away. Sometimes the vehicles carried soldiers singing drunken songs, sometimes prisoners locked inside. More than once, partisans had to force themselves not to act, to resist the urge to fire, because the odds were too heavily against them. These decisions, to strike or to wait, were constant, and they carried consequences either way. When ambushes failed, the aftermath was brutal. If the enemy discovered traps before they were sprung, they doubled patrols, bringing in dogs and armored cars. Forests were combed methodically, tree by tree, and partisans had to scatter, trusting the wilderness to shield them. They hid in rivers, submerging themselves until only noses broke the surface, or buried themselves beneath piles of leaves. Survival often depended not on strength but on patience, the ability to remain utterly still while danger passed only an arm's length away. Close calls etched themselves into memory, and these stories became warnings repeated around fires. Fighters told of comrades shot because a branch snapped too loudly, or groups betrayed because someone ignored a small rule of caution. Each tale carried its own lesson. Walk softly, speak little, trust carefully, prepare for everything. And yet, no matter how careful they were, chance played its role. A sudden rainstorm could wash away tracks, saving a group from discovery, while a curious villager's glance might betray another. Fate seemed to toy with them, sometimes protecting, sometimes destroying, never predictable. Still, survival brought strange moments of triumph. Once, a partisan group was cornered in a ravine, enemy soldiers pressing from both sides. Escape seemed impossible until a sudden fog rolled in, thick as wool, covering the valley. Using the mist as cover, the fighters climbed the slopes and vanished. Later they spoke of the fog as if it were a gift, something sent by nature itself to shield them. Whether superstition or not, it gave them a sense that the land was on their side, that forests, rivers, and skies conspired to protect them. Life after such escapes was restless. Adrenaline stayed in the blood for hours, sometimes days, making rest difficult. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by sudden jolts of fear, dreams filled with gunfire and shouts. Yet, these very experiences tightened the bonds within the group. Trust grew stronger when comrades had fled together, hidden together, lived through terror side by side. They became more than fighters. They became brothers and sisters forged in the fire of survival. Even after close calls, they still had to eat, still had to keep moving, still had to carry on. Daily routines did not pause for fear. After a night of escape, the next morning might find them searching for mushrooms, or setting traps for rabbits, or repairing boots with scraps of leather. These simple tasks grounded them, pulling them back from the edge of panic. Cooking a thin soup from nettles or chewing stale bread was a reminder that life, however fragile, continued. Sometimes, in the wake of a narrow escape, laughter broke out unexpectedly. A fighter might mimic the clumsy way a soldier had tripped during a chase, or joke about how their heart had nearly burst from running. Humor, even dark humor, was a way to reclaim power from fear. To laugh at danger was to show that it had not fully conquered them. Around campfires, these retellings became almost like legends, stories to be repeated and embellished, reminders of how close death had come and how they had survived. But survival carried a price. The face of a comrade left behind, the memory of someone who did not run fast enough, lingered. Grief was rarely spoken aloud, but it pressed heavily on hearts. Sometimes fighters kept small tokens of the fallen. A cap, a knife, a letter never delivered. These objects became talismans, carried from camp to camp, silent reminders of the cost of resistance. No one said it directly, but every fighter knew that their own possessions might one day be carried in the same way. Villages also carried scars from these close encounters. After raids, silence often fell over streets. Houses stood empty, and survivors lived with the memory of fire and loss. Yet, remarkably, some still chose to support the fighters. Perhaps it was anger that outweighed fear, or perhaps it was the stubborn belief that freedom required sacrifice. Bread was baked again, barns opened again, secret signals exchanged again. Even after punishment, the cycle continued, resistance reborn from ashes. For the partisans themselves, each narrow escape became a strange mixture of relief and weariness. Relief because they had lived another day, weariness because they knew it would happen again. The war did not pause, and neither could they. Their existence was a continuous chain of risks, each link leading to the next. And so they kept moving, kept hiding, kept striking, carried forward not only by duty but by the simple desire to see another dawn. The forest seemed alive in those days, not just with the rustle of leaves and the call of owls, but with the weight of secrets, heavy and unspoken. A single broken twig at night could send a wave of tension through every man and woman huddled under the canopy. Yet, strangely, there was also a sense of belonging. When you joined the partisans, you gave up comfort, you gave up family, but you stepped into something that tied you closer than blood. These were people who would give their last crumb of bread to you and expect nothing in return, because tomorrow you might be the one dragging them from the mud under gunfire. That bond was unshakable. What most people don't imagine is how much waiting there was. Days stretched into weeks where nothing dramatic happened. You sat in the damp, your boots never quite dry, your stomach never quite full, your nerves always stretched thin. Sometimes the biggest event was a message brought by a courier, an old woman with a basket of eggs who looked like any other villager. Inside the basket might be a scrap of paper telling you when to move, where weapons would be hidden, or worse, news of someone who had been captured. And even then, the language was coded. A wedding meant a sabotage mission, firewood meant ammunition, and rain tomorrow might mean danger. You had to read carefully, because one misunderstanding could cost lives. Food was never guaranteed. People romanticize resistance fighters, but the truth is often humiliating. There were days when the group boiled tree bark to make it soft enough to chew. A captured German supply truck was like striking gold, not only for weapons but for canned food, biscuits, and sometimes even chocolate. Imagine sitting in a cold cave, your fingers cracked from frost, and someone handing you a piece of chocolate that had once been meant for an enemy soldier. The sweetness wasn't just sugar. It was hope, proof that life outside war still existed, and it could make hardened men laugh like children for a moment. Entertainment, too, took strange forms. There were no radios most of the time, no books to pass around, no stages for plays. Instead, stories became the currency of survival. Around a dim fire, whispers carried tales of childhood, of farms now reduced to ashes, of cities some had never even seen but dreamed of visiting. Songs, sometimes just humming half-forgotten melodies, stitched the silence together. A man with an accordion was worth almost as much as a man with a rifle. Music reminded them that they were still human, still alive, still capable of joy in defiance of everything pressing against them. The Germans feared the partisans more than they admitted. Rumors spread among soldiers about ghosts in the forest, men who moved silently, struck without warning, then melted back into the trees. Some of these stories were exaggerated, of course, but the fear was real. That fear became a weapon in itself. A single ambush on a supply train might paralyze an entire region, forcing the occupiers to waste energy and resources guarding every road, every bridge. The partisans knew they could never win by sheer strength, but they could bleed the enemy through patience and unpredictability. But being unpredictable came with a cost. You could never stay in one place for too long. Caves, abandoned barns, root cellars, even burrows dug into hillsides became temporary homes. You learned to sleep lightly, boots on, rifle within reach. Dreams were rare. Exhaustion swallowed them before they could form. Yet even in that constant movement, there were strange moments of peace. Watching snow fall silently over the forest, or the sudden burst of spring flowers in a meadow scarred by bomb craters. It reminded everyone that nature carried on, indifferent to the chaos of men. And then there was betrayal. The shadow no one spoke of too loudly, but everyone feared. Not every villager was loyal. Some worked with the occupiers out of desperation or greed. A loaf of bread, a pouch of tobacco, or simply the promise of safety was enough to turn someone into an informer. Partisans had to be cautious about whom they trusted, even among their own ranks. A careless word to the wrong ear could doom an entire camp. That paranoia ate at people, making them glance twice at every smile, listen too carefully to every laugh. Still, they pressed on because hesitation was more dangerous than fear. One strange fact many forget: partisans often relied on captured enemy uniforms. Dressing as a German soldier allowed them to move unnoticed, to slip through checkpoints, to approach targets without raising alarm. But wearing that uniform carried a deadly risk. If caught by either side, enemy or ally, you were as good as dead. Yet men and women still did it, because the disguise could mean the difference between striking a blow for freedom and being hunted like an animal. The winters were the hardest. Cold seeped into bones, into thoughts, until even courage felt frozen. Fires had to be hidden, their smoke invisible, so sometimes you simply endured the freezing nights. Blankets were rare, coats often stolen or scavenged. More than one partisan carried frostbite scars for the rest of their lives. And yet, in the depth of those winters, small miracles happened too. Villagers risking everything brought hot soup, bread baked in secret, wool mittens knit in the dark. Those gifts weren't just survival, they were proof that the world still cared, that the fight wasn't in vain. And through it all, hope flickered like a stubborn flame. Not every day, not in every heart, but enough to keep the group moving. Hope that someday they would see liberation, that the forests would no longer be hiding places but simply forests again. Hope that the laughter of children would once more echo through the villages instead of the stomp of boots. And hope that all the sacrifice, all the hunger, all the silence endured in the shadows would mean something in the end. Nightfall in the partisan world was never gentle. Darkness was both a shield and a threat, and the forest seemed to transform into a living maze where every shadow could conceal salvation or death. Fighters moved in whispered steps, relying on memory, instinct, and the soft guidance of older comrades who had walked the paths countless times. A branch breaking underfoot could mean instant discovery, and yet motion was essential. Supplies had to be delivered, ambushes prepared, messages sent, and sometimes the faintest glimmer of hope arrived under the veil of night. Communication with the outside world was always a delicate art. Coded letters, secret signals, and carefully chosen phrases ensured that news traveled without exposing the messengers. Allied support came infrequently but meaningfully. Parachute drops were legendary moments. A crate landing in a meadow could contain rifles, ammunition, radios, or even food. Partisans would rush through the undergrowth, sometimes guided by torches or lanterns carefully hidden from enemy patrols, to retrieve the supplies before the enemy discovered them. Yet the drops were dangerous, too. If a plane crashed or the enemy detected the operation, it could mean disaster for anyone nearby. Night raids, small and precise, became a hallmark of partisan activity. A handful of fighters would slip into enemy positions to sabotage supply lines, destroy vehicles, or free prisoners. These operations were not always about killing. Often, they were designed to disrupt, to sow confusion, to show the occupiers that the forest and its people could not be tamed. Timing was everything. A single misstep, a shout, a misfired shot, a miscalculation of the wind, could transform a daring success into tragedy. And yet, these risks were taken repeatedly because the gains, however small, were vital to morale. Life between missions was a fragile rhythm of work and waiting. They scavenged for food, patched up clothing, repaired weapons, and maintained the shelters that were barely more than holes in the earth. Cooking became a precise skill, boiling nettles or roots over a fire that could not reveal their position, stretching a small piece of bread to last 2 meals, even eating what most would consider inedible just to survive. And when food was found, a stolen loaf, a rabbit snared by a trap, it was shared carefully. Hunger created tensions as easily as it created solidarity. Arguments flared when someone hoarded, but solidarity often prevailed, because without each other, survival was impossible. Emotions ran deep in these groups, though expressed subtly. There was camaraderie in whispered jokes, in shared silences, in the tiny gestures of passing water or covering someone with an extra blanket at night. And sometimes, even in war, there was room for love. Partisans whispered their feelings amid the shadows, careful not to let vulnerability attract danger, yet finding in each other warmth that reminded them they were still human. These bonds were fleeting and fragile because a single enemy patrol could scatter them, but they were as necessary as food or ammunition. They were what kept spirits alive when the forest pressed too heavily, when the enemy seemed omnipresent. The mental strain of constant vigilance cannot be overstated. Fighters lived with a persistent hum of fear, a nervous rhythm in the blood that never fully rested. Dreams were haunted by past skirmishes and imagined betrayals. Decisions had to be made in seconds, whether to strike or flee, whether to trust a villager or leave them behind, whether to risk a supply run or conserve energy for the inevitable next confrontation. Yet partisans adapted. Their senses became sharper, their reflexes faster, their ability to vanish into shadows nearly instinctive. Life demanded nothing less. Weather was another constant adversary. Rain turned paths into mud, making movement slow and leaving traces that could lead soldiers directly to them. Snow covered tracks but brought freezing cold, frostbite, and hypothermia. Summer heat drained strength, made fires impossible without smoke revealing their positions, and made insects nearly unbearable. Every season brought unique challenges, and partisans learned to read the land like a map written in danger. Streams, hills, and trees were not just terrain. They were allies, guides, and sometimes deadly obstacles. Humor, when it surfaced, was sharp and necessary. Jokes about clumsy patrols, exaggerated tales of enemy mistakes, and playful pranks kept spirits from collapsing under relentless tension. Even small moments, like teasing a comrade about a missing sock or a burnt meal, became invaluable. In the absence of comfort, laughter was a fragile luxury that reminded them they were still alive, still human, and still resisting. Despite all precautions, betrayal or miscalculation could happen. Partisans had to remain constantly alert. One story tells of a group cornered after a message fell into enemy hands. They spent an entire day hiding in a river gorge, soaked to the skin, shivering, listening as soldiers searched nearby. They survived, but not without scars, both visible and invisible. That night, they huddled together, sharing the tiniest portions of food and speaking little. Survival, they realized, was as much about endurance and timing as it was about courage. In these conditions, small victories became monumental. Burning a supply depot, rescuing a captured comrade, or even simply escaping an ambush brought a surge of adrenaline and relief. These triumphs were celebrated quietly. A shared smile, a small sip of coffee, or a whispered acknowledgement that, for today, they had beaten the odds. And yet, even these victories came tinged with the awareness of what could have been lost. The forest taught them that life was never simple, that freedom was never guaranteed, and that courage often meant accepting constant risk. Every day, partisans balanced on this knife's edge, moving through shadows, sharing bread, and forging bonds stronger than any chain. They were hunters and ghosts, guardians and wanderers, dreamers and survivors. In every whispered plan, every stolen loaf, every night spent lying in cold underbrush, they became something remarkable. Not because of the battles won or lost, but because of the sheer persistence of living, resisting, and refusing to vanish into the darkness. The forest became more than just a home. It became a theater of constant strategy, a place where every step, every shadow, and every sound was a part of a delicate game. Partisans were not trained soldiers in the conventional sense, yet they learned tactics that rivaled formal armies in ingenuity. Every bridge, Every road, every rail line was a potential target, and every operation required careful planning. They studied maps, memorized patrol routes, noted the timing of supply trucks, and learned to anticipate enemy behavior with uncanny precision. Success depended on patience as much as skill, and mistakes were unforgiving. Sabotage was their weapon of choice because it did not require large numbers or heavy artillery. Simple actions, like felling a tree across a road or loosening the rails on a train track, could delay enemy operations for days. Partisans understood the psychology of disruption. A supply truck derailed on a narrow mountain pass sent soldiers scrambling, stretching their forces thin and creating openings for further action. Even small, well-timed explosions had an outsized effect, forcing the occupiers to move cautiously, to doubt the safety of every path. In this way, the resistance became a constant thorn, invisible yet painfully real. Each operation carried its own tension. Fighters crept through the forest in the darkness, balancing stealth with speed. They measured each movement carefully, checking that leaves would not rustle, that twigs would not snap. Improvised explosives were often used, carefully crafted from stolen materials, fertilizer, or scrap metal. Making them required patience, precision, and nerves of steel, because a single miscalculation could mean death not just for the maker, but for the entire group. They carried their lives in their hands, quite literally, with every fuse, wire, or pin holding the difference between success and catastrophe. Night raids on enemy convoys were exercises in both courage and timing. Fighters would position themselves along curves in a road, in deep ditches or behind boulders, waiting for the vehicles to approach. They watched the wheels turn, calculated distances, and then acted with practiced precision. Sometimes a small fire or explosion would force the soldiers to abandon a truck, scattering supplies across the ground. Other times, the group's mere presence was enough to create confusion. Smoke, fire, sudden gunfire, and the sounds of chaos were as effective psychologically as they were materially. Afterward, they melted back into the forest, leaving no trace, their presence known only by the disruption they had caused. But strategy extended beyond the immediate. Partisans often coordinated with distant groups, passing messages through villages, using couriers, or relying on radio signals when available. Information about troop movements, supply schedules, and enemy reinforcements could mean the difference between a successful operation and a fatal ambush. These networks, improvised and fragile, became lifelines. The resistance was not just a local struggle. It was a hidden war spanning regions, with each small action contributing to a larger goal. Yet the constant pressure was relentless. Even after a successful mission, the aftermath was not always celebratory. Soldiers would retaliate with brutal efficiency. Villages could be burned, livestock taken, families interrogated. Partisans had to reconcile their victories with the inevitable consequences, carrying the weight of decisions made under duress. Each success was bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that danger was never far behind. The emotional strain of leadership fell heavily on the older, more experienced fighters. They were responsible not just for tactics and operations, but for the lives of those younger and less experienced. Decisions were made in moments, often without complete information, and every choice could ripple through the group with deadly consequences. Teaching newcomers how to move quietly, how to ration food, how to hide tracks. These lessons were often learned the hard way, sometimes at the cost of lives. Yet, despite the burden, leaders also carried a strange pride. They saw in their comrades resilience, courage, and ingenuity that rivaled any formal military unit. Food remained a constant concern. Supply lines were fragile, scavenging dangerous. A captured warehouse, a hidden cellar, or a sympathetic farmer could provide temporary relief, but never permanence. Partisans learned to forage, to trap small animals, to eat wild plants with knowledge passed down from villagers and older fighters. Even in these acts of survival, strategy was key. Gathering food meant choosing paths that would not reveal the group's location, moving quietly, sometimes in pairs or trios to keep watch. The forest was generous in its own way, but it demanded respect and caution, or it could kill. Morale was fragile, yet incredibly resilient. Small rituals emerged. A shared song, a whispered joke, a game of chance with carved dice, or an improvised card game. These moments, brief and fleeting, reminded fighters that beyond the forest, beyond the war, they were still human. Humor and camaraderie became survival tools as vital as rifles and knives. In these moments, laughter was a rebellion against despair, a declaration that even in shadow, life persisted. Alliances with civilians were critical but precarious. Villagers who supplied food, medicine, or information risked everything. In return, partisans offered protection, guidance, and sometimes gifts stolen from enemy supplies. Trust had to be carefully earned, for betrayal could lurk anywhere. A misstep, a careless word, or a misjudged glance could undo months of effort. And yet, the bonds that formed in these interactions were often deeper than any ordinary friendship, forged in the crucible of shared risk and shared purpose. The weight of secrets was constant. Plans, identities, supply caches, escape routes. Every piece of knowledge carried its own danger. If captured, revealing anything could mean death for the group. Fighters learned to speak in half-truths, to nod when questioned, to keep their eyes calm even as panic raced beneath the surface. Silence became a skill as valuable as any weapon. And yet, despite the constant vigilance, life persisted. Friendship, courage, hope, they endured, intertwined with fear, like roots growing through rocks, persistent and stubborn. Evenings often ended in reflection. Fighters would sit near hidden fires, listening to the wind and rain, thinking about missions past, about friends lost, about dreams postponed. They spoke little, for every sound could be dangerous, but the silence was full of understanding. Each person knew the burdens of the other, the moments of bravery and the moments of doubt. In those quiet hours, the forest was both a sanctuary and a witness, holding their secrets as tightly as the fighters held each other. Winter in the forests of Europe brought an unforgiving new dimension to the partisan struggle. Snow-blanketed paths, hiding footprints but slowing movement, making every step heavier, every breath visible in pale clouds. Fingers and toes went numb in minutes, and frostbite became a silent enemy as lethal as any rifle. Fires were a constant risk, necessary to survive the nights, yet revealing if the smoke betrayed their location. They learned to create small, hidden flames, sometimes barely enough to warm hands, cooking meager meals of roots, dried meat, or stolen grains while remaining invisible to prying eyes. Every morsel was rationed carefully. Hunger sharpened senses but wore down the body, leaving fighters constantly balancing survival against exhaustion. The cold amplified every sound. A branch snapping, the wind howling through the treetops, or the distant bark of a dog could mean disaster. Partisans adapted, moving silently like shadows, their senses tuned to the forest in ways that seemed almost unnatural. They memorized the patterns of the wind, the rhythms of snowfall, and the subtle changes in the terrain, knowing these details could hide them or expose them. The forest was both friend and foe, offering concealment and resources but never forgiving carelessness. During these long months, routines became rigid yet fluid. Meals, if any existed, were simple, often shared in near silence to avoid attracting attention. Sleep was fragmented, taken in short bursts, always with weapons nearby. Training was ongoing, subtle, and improvisational. Practicing movement through snow, maintaining firearms in freezing conditions, improvising traps and obstacles for enemy patrols. Even in the quiet, every action was part of a larger plan, each small skill honed for survival and sabotage. Alliances with local villagers were more crucial than ever in winter. Farmers brought what little food they could spare, often risking brutal retaliation. In return, partisans shared intelligence, warned of approaching patrols, or assisted in small tasks that made life marginally easier for the locals. The trust was fragile and precious. Even one misstep could destroy it. Yet, these bonds were lifelines, threads that connected the hidden fighters to a world beyond the forest and reminded them that they were not entirely isolated. Night raids and sabotage operations took on a heightened tension during winter. Frozen roads and thick snow made movement slow, predictable, but also allowed for creative tactics. Bridges could be iced to collapse under vehicles, tracks hidden under snow for sabotage, and patrols misled with subtle visual cues. Every mission was a careful blend of planning, improvisation, and nerve. Fighters moved like ghosts through the white landscape, aware that any misjudgment could end in capture or death. Even the wind could betray them, carrying a sound, a scent, or a plume of smoke into the wrong direction. The psychological burden was intense. Cold, hunger, constant vigilance, and the ever-present threat of death or betrayal weighed heavily on even the strongest. Sleep-deprived minds conjured threats, imagined soldiers hiding behind every tree, and replayed every past mission with imagined mistakes. Fighters learned to master these thoughts, to compartmentalize fear, using humor, whispered stories, or fleeting memories of home as shields. Laughter in the forest became rare but extraordinarily valuable, a reminder that despite circumstances, they were alive, human, and connected. Even within this harsh environment, partisans found moments of beauty and solace. Snowflakes clinging to branches, the stark light of a frozen river reflecting the moon, or the sudden movement of an animal through the trees reminded them that life persisted beyond war. These glimpses of nature's resilience mirrored their own, reinforcing determination and patience. And even small victories, stealing a sack of flour, rescuing an isolated villager, or successfully derailing a supply truck, carried amplified meaning in the harshness of winter. Interactions among the fighters deepened in these months. Friendships strengthened in shared suffering, and bonds sometimes deepened into secret romances or quiet affection. Every touch, every glance carried risk, yet also comfort. These relationships became a critical form of emotional sustenance, grounding the fighters in a sense of humanity amid relentless adversity. Even fleeting, whispered confessions or shared blankets during freezing nights became acts of resistance against the dehumanization of war. Partisans developed clever strategies to evade discovery. Tracks were hidden under snow, decoys set to mislead patrols, and sometimes they even moved during blizzards to take advantage of nature's concealment. Frost could preserve footprints but also cover traps, and the fighters learned to anticipate the interplay of weather and terrain. They became artists of evasion, blending seamlessly into the landscape, their survival dependent not only on skill and courage, but on intimate knowledge of the forest itself. Supplies, always limited, were rationed meticulously. Hunting small game became essential, and preserved meats, nuts, and roots formed the backbone of winter survival. Food preparation was a delicate art, balancing caloric needs with stealth and resource conservation. Every action, from boiling water to melting snow for drinking, carried strategic weight, and mistakes could mean illness or exposure. Even the smallest accomplishment, a well-cooked soup, a captured rabbit, was celebrated quietly, fueling both body and morale. Through this relentless combination of risk, hardship, and ingenuity, partisans carved out a fragile, almost invisible world. They became experts in the dance between visibility and concealment, courage and caution, hope and despair. Every day was a lesson, every encounter a test, every silent step a choice between survival and catastrophe. And yet, despite the cold, hunger, and constant threat of death, they pressed forward, fueled by loyalty, defiance, and an unyielding will to resist. The forests were their home, but sometimes the war drew them into the villages and towns, where danger took on a new, more immediate dimension. Infiltration was a delicate, almost ritualized art. Partisans dressed as villagers or enemy soldiers, adopting accents, gestures, and habits they had observed for weeks. Every movement had to be precise, every glance calculated. A misstep, a dropped tool, a wrong word, the wrong turn on a street could expose them instantly, turning a successful mission into a lethal trap. They learned to move like shadows, to melt into the crowds, to become invisible in plain sight, because visibility meant death. Supplies were often hidden in plain sight in towns, bakeries, market stalls, or the cellars of sympathetic households. Partisans would slip through cobbled streets under the cover of darkness, sometimes guided by villagers who had risked everything to assist them. Their movements were timed meticulously. An approaching patrol, a passing horse-drawn cart, or the nightly routines of shopkeepers could all influence the timing of an operation. The smallest details, footsteps, the clink of coins, the smell of freshly baked bread, were both obstacles and markers, helping them gauge the rhythms of the occupied towns. Sabotage in urban areas demanded ingenuity. A carefully placed fire in a warehouse could destroy munitions, but it also risked civilian lives and reprisals. Partisans often used minor explosions, disruption, and diversionary tactics to achieve maximum effect with minimal risk. Sometimes they would create a small commotion, breaking a window or dropping a crate, to distract soldiers while the real action unfolded elsewhere. It was a constant game of observation, strategy, and nerve, requiring patience and improvisation at every step. Every infiltration carried psychological weight. Fighters had to remain calm under intense scrutiny, concealing both fear and purpose. They learned to read faces, interpreting expressions to anticipate danger. Soldiers could be unpredictable, some cruel, some sloppy, others vigilant, and partisans had to adjust instantly. The mental strain was constant. A single misjudgment could not only doom the operation but bring ruin to the forest camps and the villagers who had aided them. Yet, these risks were embraced because the stakes were immense. Every act of sabotage weakened the occupiers' control. Every successful mission sustained hope. Trust within the group was as vital in towns as it was in forests. Newcomers were watched, evaluated, and tested. Leaders observed not just skill, but composure under pressure, judgment, and the ability to improvise. Mistakes in a city could have consequences far beyond the immediate operation. A single failed attempt might trigger enemy searches through nearby forests or the arrest of villagers. Awareness of these stakes infused each mission with tension, but also with a grim clarity. Success was survival, failure was catastrophe, and the line between the two was razor-thin. Food and shelter were scarce in towns as well. Occupied villages offered only fleeting respite. Partisans often relied on secret caches hidden in attics, cellars, or behind false walls. Some villagers risked their lives to provide small meals or warm clothing. Even a single loaf of bread or a handful of soup could be the difference between maintaining strength for the next operation and succumbing to fatigue. Sharing these resources was both a necessity and a moral imperative, reinforcing the bonds of trust and loyalty that held the group together in the shadow of constant danger. Urban life demanded a different kind of patience. Hours might be spent waiting in empty streets, listening to the clatter of boots, the murmur of conversation, or the creak of shutters. Observing patrol schedules, timing the routines of guards, and studying the habits of local collaborators became an essential survival skill. It was a subtle, almost invisible warfare, intelligence gathering that required as much courage and cunning as any ambush. The partisans understood that knowledge could be as powerful as gunfire, that understanding enemy movements often precluded unnecessary risks. At night, when operations were over, fighters retreated to their hidden sanctuaries, secret rooms, barns, or abandoned buildings. They cleaned weapons, bandaged wounds, and shared small stories to maintain morale. Conversations were quiet, deliberate, and often punctuated by the tense awareness of danger outside. Despite the constant risk, small gestures, a shared piece of bread, a quiet laugh, a whispered compliment, became vital, tiny reminders of human connection amid chaos. Even in occupied towns, life persisted in subtle, almost defiant ways. Rumors and legends circulated within urban networks. Tales of ghosts who moved undetected through patrols, liberated prisoners who vanished into the forest, and daring raids that left soldiers bewildered served not just as entertainment, but as a reinforcement of morale. Fighters repeated these stories to one another, embellishing details, celebrating cleverness, and internalizing lessons of caution, stealth, and audacity. Each retelling was both a tribute to survival and a teaching tool, reinforcing the knowledge that could mean life or death. The tension between freedom and constraint was never more palpable than in towns. Every street offered potential for both opportunity and danger. Partisans had to navigate this terrain with precision, courage, and improvisation. Their actions, whether simple observation, sabotage, or direct confrontation, were part of a larger tapestry, each thread contributing to a delicate balance of resistance. Success required not just skill, but intuition, courage, and the relentless determination to act in the face of near-certain peril. Through these experiences, fighters honed a dual existence: ghostly shadows in the towns, rooted and resourceful in the forests. Their ability to transition between environments, adapt strategies, and maintain vigilance defined their effectiveness. Every mission, every moment of patience, every calculated risk contributed to a larger narrative of resistance, survival, and the persistence of human spirit in the most dangerous of times. The struggle of partisans was not confined to a single forest, a single village, or even a single country. Across Europe, pockets of resistance communicated in secrecy, their networks fragile but vital. Couriers moved through the night carrying messages on foot, horseback, or sometimes hidden in the cargo of sympathetic merchants. Each message, often nothing more than a scrap of paper with a coded phrase, could shift the balance between success and disaster. Coordination with other groups allowed simultaneous attacks, supply sharing, and intelligence gathering, magnifying the impact of even the smallest cell. Yet the cost of miscommunication was grave. An incorrectly timed ambush could lead to total exposure, capture, or death. Partisans often met in clandestine locations, rarely more than a handful of trusted fighters at a time. Underground chambers, abandoned barns, and secluded groves served as meeting points, their coordinates memorized but never written down. There, strategies were discussed quietly, maps traced with fingers in dirt or candlelight, and supplies carefully distributed. Every gesture, every glance, carried meaning. A pause might indicate caution, a nod might confirm a plan, and a misplaced word could shatter months of preparation. The tension was constant, but so was the quiet exhilaration of working toward a shared goal that transcended individual survival. Betrayal lingered as an invisible threat, shaping every decision. Even among trusted comrades, suspicion could surface. New members were tested in subtle ways, sent on small reconnaissance missions or asked to transport messages. Observers watched reactions closely. Hesitation, nervous glances, or excessive questions might signal unreliability. The presence of collaborators within villages, often motivated by fear, greed, or desperation, added another layer of danger. Partisans learned to interpret subtle cues, to sense when a seemingly ordinary act could carry hidden consequences. The line between friend and foe was often blurred, and the stakes could not be overstated. Resourcefulness was as crucial as courage. When supplies ran low, fighters improvised relentlessly. Ammunition was sometimes salvaged from battlefield remnants or carefully dismantled from enemy caches. Clothing was patched, repaired, and layered to endure the cold, and tools were fashioned from wood, metal scraps, and whatever materials could be found. Even food became a matter of ingenuity. Wild plants were foraged with knowledge passed down from villagers, traps were set to capture small game, and scavenged rations were stretched meticulously. Survival required constant creativity, blending experience, observation, and daring in a way few outside the resistance could imagine. The psychological pressure was relentless. Fighters carried the weight of lives, both their own and others, in every decision. A failed mission could mean the capture of comrades, the destruction of a supply cache, or reprisals against innocent civilians. Moments of doubt were inevitable. Some nights, partisans would sit silently, listening to the wind through the trees, pondering the consequences of choices they had made or had yet to make. Sleep was fitful, often in shifts, with weapons close and senses alert, because the line between safety and danger was measured in seconds. Despite the constant threat, human resilience manifested in remarkable ways. Bonds between fighters deepened, friendships forged under duress and danger became unbreakable. Even small acts, a shared portion of food, a whispered joke, a hand offered in warmth, strengthened the fragile moral fabric of the group. Laughter, though rare, became an act of defiance, proof that even amid fear, life and humanity persisted. In these moments, partisans were reminded why they endured, why they risked everything in the name of freedom and resistance. Intelligence gathering was a silent war in itself. Fighters observed patrol routines, noted the habits of collaborators, and memorized the layouts of towns and villages. Each detail mattered: the timing of a guard change, the pattern of livestock movements, or the positioning of supplies could be exploited. These observations were shared with precision, often in hushed voices, reinforcing the intricate web of resistance. Knowledge in this world was power. A single piece of accurate intelligence could save lives, facilitate a raid, or prevent a catastrophe. Supply raids and rescues were orchestrated with both boldness and caution. Partisans struck quickly and disappeared, leaving confusion in their wake. Occasionally, a mission involved freeing captured fighters or villagers, navigating through enemy territory with careful coordination and an almost preternatural understanding of timing. These operations tested every skill acquired in months of training and experience. Stealth, speed, improvisation, and above all, the capacity to remain calm under pressure. Success brought relief, pride, and a brief, almost sacred moment of celebration, but it was always shadowed by the knowledge that danger lurked in every direction. Even in moments of apparent calm, partisans remained alert. Conversations were measured, movements deliberate, and trust carefully managed. The forest and towns were not passive environments. They were dynamic landscapes filled with opportunity and threat alike. Every encounter, whether with civilians, enemy patrols, or fellow fighters, carried consequences. Life in the resistance required constant assessment of risk, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to both mission and comrades. Through these interconnected networks, resourceful improvisation, and relentless courage, partisans carved out a hidden war that challenged the occupiers in ways few conventional armies could. They existed in shadows, surviving on ingenuity, alliances, and sheer human determination. Every raid, every supply run, every cautious step through snow or shadow was part of a larger narrative, a testament to resilience, defiance, and the enduring will to resist oppression against overwhelming odds. Even amidst the chaos of war, partisans sought the smallest threads of normalcy, clinging to routines and tiny joys that reminded them they were still human. Days began before sunrise, not with the comfort of warmth, but with the cold bite of early morning and the quiet rustle of companions stirring. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was often a meager portion of dried bread, nuts, or foraged plants, eaten in near silence while eyes scanned the surroundings for signs of danger. The act of eating itself became ritualized. Chew slowly, conserve energy, avoid waste, and always leave no trace. Every bite mattered, every morsel counted, because scarcity defined life in the forest and towns alike. Movement became a constant necessity. Fighters patrolled paths, reinforced traps, and checked hidden supply caches. They moved like shadows, using the terrain as both cover and guide, weaving through trees, slipping over frozen streams, and balancing silently on rocks. The forest and villages became a language of its own. Each branch, stone, and footprint communicated danger, opportunity, or a path forward. Experienced fighters could read it instinctively, while newcomers learned quickly, often through the harshest lessons. The rhythm of this life was demanding, yet strangely familiar. It became the heartbeat of the resistance, a cadence that shaped thought, movement, and even dreams. Evenings offered fleeting moments of relief, often spent tending to injuries, repairing weapons, or simply huddling around small, hidden fires. The rituals of these moments were as much about maintaining morale as they were about survival. Stories were shared, not just of missions, but of childhoods left behind, of dreams postponed, of impossible hopes for a life beyond the war. In these quiet exchanges, partisans found connection, empathy, and reminders of what they were fighting for. Conversations were low, deliberate, and punctuated by the understanding that silence could sometimes be the only safeguard. Entertainment, scarce and improvisational, became a survival tool. Games of chance using carved stones or scraps of paper, whispered songs, and occasional storytelling broke the monotony and tension. Humor, though dark and sardonic, offered a mental reprieve. Jokes about blunders during reconnaissance or exaggerated tales of enemy foolishness became rituals that reinforced both skill and morale. Laughter, rare as it was, became a defiant act against despair, a shared acknowledgement that even in the shadow of death, life persisted. Food, the most persistent challenge, required ingenuity and cooperation. Hunters set traps for rabbits, snares for birds, and sometimes waded into rivers to catch fish. Foraged berries, roots, and edible plants supplemented stolen supplies or gifts from sympathetic villagers. Every meal was an exercise in strategy, rationing to sustain energy, hiding portions to prevent theft, and balancing nutrition with stealth. The act of cooking, even over the smallest flame, became both a necessity and a subtle art. Timing, smoke control, and vigilance ensured that sustenance did not become a signal to the enemy. The partisans' clothing and equipment reflected a life of constant improvisation. Layers of patched fabric, worn boots, and scarves served to protect against the elements and conceal identity. Weapons were maintained meticulously. Rifles and pistols cleaned and oiled, knives sharpened, traps checked and reset. The attention to detail was not obsessive but essential. A poorly maintained weapon or a frayed layer of clothing could mean the difference between life and death in the unforgiving environment of occupied Europe. Yet, even in survival and strategy, small rituals grounded the human spirit. Moments of quiet reflection, shared glances, or whispered affirmations reminded fighters of their humanity. Some collected simple mementos: a small coin, a feather, or a flower tucked into a pocket, symbols of a world beyond the forest and war. These tokens became anchors for hope, reminders that despite suffering, life, beauty, and meaning persisted beyond the immediate struggle. Partisans also found time to observe and respect nature. They noticed the changing seasons, the growth of plants, the migration of birds, and the subtle patterns of weather. These observations were not merely aesthetic, they were practical, informing decisions about movement, timing, and survival strategies. Yet, in recognizing the rhythm of the natural world, fighters found moments of serenity, fleeting but profound, that contrasted sharply with the constant demands of survival. Communication remained both critical and precarious. Messages between cells, intelligence reports, and coordination with other resistance groups required subtlety and discretion. Couriers memorized routes, hid messages in everyday objects, and used coded language to convey critical information. A single error could expose an entire network, yet the flow of information kept operations coordinated and effective, reinforcing the interconnectedness of resistance efforts across forests, villages, and towns. Even boredom became a challenge, paradoxically as dangerous as hunger or cold. Fighters learned to occupy their minds, inventing tasks, refining skills, and devising plans for potential raids. Idle hands could lead to mistakes, carelessness, or lowered vigilance. Focus, discipline, and mental engagement became tools for survival, sharpening awareness and maintaining the edge that separated success from catastrophe. Through these routines, rituals, and relentless effort, the partisans maintained a delicate balance. The constant vigilance of survival combined with fleeting, essential reminders of humanity, connection, and hope. Life in the shadows was brutal, yet these small acts, meals shared, stories whispered, laughter fleeting, became as vital as any weapon. In the interplay of danger, ingenuity, and resilience, they carved out a space for life, defiance, and the unbroken persistence of human spirit in the most unforgiving circumstances imaginable.